Well, here we are. It's the fourth Sunday of Advent. Can you believe it? Christmas is around the corner. I can't believe it. So today I'm not going to present any new content. We're going to do a variation on the Examen prayer using art. So the practice will be different, but there won't be new information, new content per se. If you're just joining us, just a reminder to have some sort of art supplies ready, markers, colored pencils, a piece of paper. Could just be a pen and paper. I think art, visual art, allows us to work more in our right brain and just connect to that more intuitive sense we have of our lives and reality. So that's the beauty of using art for something like this. For somebody like me, who's a very left brain person, it really helps kind of shift me into a different space for prayer and contemplation. So before we do that, let's just quickly review where we've been so far. In that first week, we talked about the gratitude piece and just spent the entire session on that gratitude practice. We listed those 20 things or 5 things that we're grateful for. The thing about gratitude is that it's expansive, right? It expands our hearts, and it even expands our perceptions, so that when we practice gratitude, I find when I practice gratitude that I notice more of the world around me. It's very expansive in that way. So that was the first week. The second Sunday of Advent, we got together and I introduced you to the 5 classic steps of the Examen that begin with gratitude. And there we emphasized that really it's important to be fluid and flexible around this. I mean, I'm going to give you some resources at the end of this session to take this further. But if you read different articles and books on the Examen, they'll give you slightly different steps than I've presented here. So, if these so-called experts can't quite agree, I would say just don't worry about the order and the number of these steps very much. Ignatius is big into do what works and forget the rest, which I think is a good practice. So do what works for you here. But we also talked about how it's helpful to have something to fall back on when prayer is dry, right? And for weeks and weeks or months, we don't have that affective experience of God, and it's not nourishing, and it's just something we do because it's our practice. In those moments, it's really helpful to have those steps because it provides a little scaffolding and it allows us to at least show up and do something, even if we don't feel anything. And then last week, we talked a little bit about spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation as one language of God. God has many languages, the Holy Scriptures of all the world's religions, nature, trees, right? But the way God speaks to our hearts through the movements of our hearts is yet another language of God. And so we talked a little bit about that and how to pay attention to that last week. In that kind of big review part of the Examen, we talked about how the period of time you review can be as short as a day, as long as a year. We did the Examen of 2020 last week. It can be as long as a lifetime. I know some couples who every year on their anniversary will do some version of the examen together, really just kind of like sitting around the table talking about their marriage over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. We can also do a review by theme, and that's what I'm going to do today, just to show you another variation of how to do it. So rather than picking a period of time exactly and kind of walking your way through that, you can do it. Today I'm going to say, like, pick a time when you were alone, or pick a time when you were with people. It could be pick a time when you were at work, or a time you spent with your grandchildren. So you can kind of do it thematically like that as well. The whole idea of the examen is that we're rummaging for God. That's the title of an article I read once about the prayer. And the gift of it is, as we practice it, we might discover God in a moment that we might have overlooked as we were going through the day, right? We have all these small moments that, like, in the moment, it doesn't feel that significant. But as I'm reviewing the day, it's like, oh, I actually really enjoyed that, like, 30-second banter I had with the checkout lady at the grocery store. And she's somebody I see every week when I go, and I've seen her for 3 years, and I actually have a little bit of a connection with her, and I don't think much of it, but in pausing and reviewing, it's like, oh, God was present there at the checkout line. And it's just a gift to be able to notice that and savor that. We would have missed it, and that just, our day still would have been fine. It's not like that adds something essential and we can't go on without noticing it. But it makes life so much more enjoyable when we can pause and notice even those moments. Or some days when I'm praying the examen, it's not the small moment, it's like some big thing that happened that's obvious, right? And that's what I'm thinking about and praying about. But as I, maybe I had a argument with my partner, and that's all I can really think about and pray about. And so I'm not thinking about the 30-second encounter with the checkout person. I'm thinking about the argument I had with my partner. I think there's a way in which staying with it and going back to it in the examen can sometimes allow me to see that argument in a different light or from a different place. It can maybe allow me to shift or see it in context or see it from how God might be seeing it. And then as we do this day after day or week after week, year after year, we start to notice patterns. Patterns in our lives and patterns in the way that God acts in our life. And the last point I want to make here is I think it's a practice. One of the joys of this is, like, every once in a while, sort of by definition, this doesn't happen that much, at least to me, but like every once in a while, there's a surprise, like, oh, I didn't know you were there, or like, oh, of course it's like that. And the practice of showing up every day makes space for that surprise, which is just, again, a treat, I think. So a way of living life a little more richly, maybe. So let me pause there. That was just a quick review of where we've been in this practice. I'm going to unshare my screen and just see if, before we move on to today's practice, if anybody has a comment or a question that they'd like to ask of the group or of me. Yeah, Karen?
Let me unmute myself. I just wanted to clarify something so that I wasn't getting stuck in it. In the first
Yeah.
couple of weeks, when we spent so much time in the first week on the gratitude piece, I kind of overemphasized that, and I got confused between that and the review. Like,
Mm.
what's the difference? Do we go and review all those things on that original list? I'm understanding it with practice differently, and I just wanted to check in with you on that. So now I'm seeing the gratitude piece as just an opening
Right.
for whatever is going to come up later and what you're going to hear. And it may or may not involve any of those things that were in your initial gratitude. Is
That's
that?
right. Yeah, it may or it may not. And I think the way Saint Ignatius envisioned it, I think he had us begin with gratitude because it's also a way of connecting with God, right? Like when we're grateful, our hearts are automatically opening up to God. And so as we begin the review part, I think he thought, oh, it's a good idea to do that not just on our own, but with some conscious presence of God. And like you say, what you actually review may or may not be connected to that. And then like we did in that first week, sometimes from often, and I would say maybe a third to a half of the time that I pray this, I get, there's gratitude and that feels really good and I just stay in it and I don't even get to the other steps. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you.
Let's move into the practice for today, and afterwards, if you have questions or comments, you can certainly, there'll be time after also. And we're gonna focus on 4 different scenes, we can say, from this last week, and so you can divide your paper, if you have paper, into 4 quadrants. You can use 4 sheets of paper. You can do whatever you want. Kind of as I've been emphasizing throughout this series with flexibility and staying with where your heart is drawn or where the Spirit is drawing you. I'm going to lead us through these 4 moments, but if, as we're going through the second moment, there's something stirring in your heart, don't feel like you have to finish the exercise with me. You can even put me on mute. That's the beauty of doing this over Zoom, and just stay with that second moment or whatever it is. And you'll notice when we're done, even if you have me on mute, because I'll change the screen. Okay, so don't feel like you have to get through everything. The point is not to finish, but to savor. So let's begin by closing our eyes, maybe, if you're comfortable with that. Somebody shared with me recently this body awareness exercise that she calls the French press. And so what I'm going to invite you to do is just imagine that you're a French press, and you have the presser on top of you, and just slowly press down, starting at the top of your head, and slowly pressing those grounds down through your head and your neck and shoulders. Pressing down and out anything that doesn't need to be present here right now. Notice the sensations in your body as you're pressing. Through your spine, hips, down, 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 through your legs, feet, and press down through the floor down into the earth. I invite you now in your first square or your first page to draw one moment of gratitude from this past week. Any moment that comes to mind. Could be very small, could be big and obvious. If more than one comes to mind, you can just draw as many as you'd like. Again, you're drawing any moment of gratitude from this week and really savoring that moment. Just enjoying it. And as you maybe bring this square to a close or keep going, whichever you'd like, I'd like you to label it with a few feeling words. So gratitude is one of those. But see if you can notice what else was present for you in that moment. Our heartscapes are complex. And if it's helpful, I have that PowerPoint from the second week on the screen. But any words. And again, if you'd like, I invite you to stay here with gratitude and mute my voice so you can stay there. But for those who want to move to the next square, I invite you to remember a moment from this past week when you were alone. It could be for an instant, it could be for a day. Some moment that seems important for you to review, where you were alone, and draw that. Maybe another minute or so on a moment that you were alone. And again, go ahead and label that with 2 or 3 or 4 feeling words. Remembering that we can feel seemingly opposing feelings at the same time. And for those of you who'd like to continue, for the third panel, I invite you to call to mind a moment when you had an interaction with somebody else. It could be in person, it could be on Zoom, by phone, just some text, some interaction with somebody else. And again, as you wrap this square up, if you want to label this with a few feeling words, just taking a note of the subtleties of your heart. And if you'd like to move on to the last panel, here I invite you to draw any other moment of this last week that feels important to you, that you're drawn to. So again, the last panel is any other moment from this past week that's calling to you now, or that God wants you to examine again. Could be a moment of joy or grief, anger or vulnerability. A small moment, a big moment. You don't have to know why you're being drawn to this, just that you are. And again, go ahead and label that with a few feeling words. And now taking a look at the 4 panels, or 3 or 2, or however many you've done. See if there's one in particular that you're drawn to spending a little more time with, or that God might be inviting you to spend a little more time with. again, for whatever reason or no reason. Go ahead and just remember that moment. You can do it by drawing or by closing your eyes. Noticing what was happening inside and outside of you. Is there anything about this moment that God wants you to notice? And I invite you to draw into that panel some representation of the divine in that moment. How or where was God present? And if it seems like God was not present, then draw in a representation of the divine, of God, as you would have liked to have seen God present. Again, where and how did you experience the divine presence? Or if you didn't, how would you have liked to? Last week, we talked a little bit about spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation, and that God speaks to us through both. Was this a moment of feeling energized and open, grounded, peaceful and joyful? Again, it doesn't mean that the surface emotions were any of those things, but that deep current underneath. Was this a moment of spiritual desolation, emptiness, scatteredness? stuckness. I invite you to close this time of prayer by speaking to God in your heart, whatever words arise, be they words of gratitude, petition, intention, pleading, anger. And when you're ready, feel free to turn your cameras back on. Well, thank you all. I want to leave you in the moment with a few resources, but first I want to say that I've so enjoyed spending these mornings of Advent with you. Just getting to share a little bit of this beautiful practice. That I hope, if now is the right time for it in your life, you'll continue to spend time with it. Or maybe in 6 months or a year will be the right time for this practice in your life, and you'll say, oh, I remember that. I'm going to try that. Some of you are in my Wednesday night series in the fall, and my co-presenter, Michael, at the end, gifted us each with a saying from the Desert Mother or Father. And I got it, and I read it, and I didn't think anything of it. And now it's 3 months later, the last 2 weeks, it's just been in my mind. Like it's all as I'm walking, going for a run, playing with my cat, it's this phrase. So I think now is the time for that practice. And it wasn't 3 months ago when Michael first gave it to me. So this might be your time for the Examen, and it might not, but I hope that you put it in that spiritual toolbox. Just a few resources for you. This first one is also an app. I gave it to you last week or 2 weeks ago. Pray As You Go with hyphens in between. PrayAsYouGo.org by the Irish Jesuits has a lot of good audio stuff, including 4 or 5 or 6 different audio examens. But they upload a new reflection on the lectionary reading of the day but it's not like someone just talking to you the whole time. It's like music in between pauses for you to let it sink in. It's really quite nice. IgnatianSpirituality.com is a good catch-all place for all things Ignatian spirituality. And you can copy this link down, or you can navigate that page and easily find articles and such on the Examen prayer if you want to go more deeply into this. Some people like books. I love books. I recommend 2 in particular. One is called The Examen Prayer, Ignatian Wisdom for Our Lives Today by Timothy Gallagher. And it goes through the 5 classic steps. But what I love about that one is not only Timothy Gallagher's spiritual insight, but he draws on the experience of a lot of people he's seen for spiritual direction. And so there's stories of lots of ordinary people at lots of different places in their lives and how they experience the examen. It's short, it's 90 pages or 120 pages or something, but very, very good. Probably my favorite book on the examen if you want to kind of read about it. This next one, Reimagining the Ignatian Examen, Fresh Ways to Pray from Your Day, is another thin book. And there's probably 60 different forms or versions, variations of the examen prayer that you can try. So over these weeks, I've given you a few different variations. Well, there's 60 more on different themes, different ways of praying it. So it's that one's a little bit more workbook-esque, or like you pick one and try it and see if you like it, and just stay with it if you do. So those are two that I recommend. And the last thing I want to mention is just a quick plug for the organization that I currently work for, the Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest. We have a program called JV Encore, which is a program, and a lot of people at Trinity have been a part of it in the past, I know, for volunteers 50 and over. It's a service program, but really we're a spiritual formation program rooted in Ignatian spirituality. And so we use tools like the examen and community processes with one another to deepen in our lives of faith, doing justice in the world. And so probably later in the spring, when we're opening up registration for new folks in the fall, I'll let Matthew know, and he can let you know, hey, if you want to do a little service, reflection, community in this Ignatian tradition, we'll be starting up. So that's just a quick plug now. I'm seeing the people where, oh, somebody in here has done JV Encore before. That's cool. Okay, that wraps up our session for today and the series. Any last comments or questions before we go?
I just want to say again, thank you, Fumi, for a beautiful series, and can't wait to see you again in this kind of form. Thank you.
All right, great to be with you. Enjoy the rest of the Advent season and the Christmas season coming up. Take care, everybody.